Hello sailors, I'm Captain Frank Mummert of the Maryland School of Sailing and Seamanship, and I'm sitting here in the main salon of our Island Packet 40 Navigator, which we recently used to do an ASA 106 course involving a circumnavigation of the Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia Peninsula. I'd like to tell you about it. We started our course on the traditional way with all of the students, Glenn, Jose, Peter, and Sarah, and the mate, Captain Doug Riley, and myself, eating a hearty meal at a Rock Hall restaurant, getting to know each other. Now, I had prepared a list of standing rules for the trip involving the watch rotations, team assignments, and other things, and we reviewed those as well. And then after dinner, the crew returned to Navigator and we settled in for the evening. Now, Saturday began at dawn with breakfast and cabin stowing, followed by discussion of how the navigation process would work. Doug and I explained how we would use our paper-based resources to prepare the navigational plan and then use the electronics to stay on track from waypoint to waypoint. After this, we went through the boat using the 106 Procedures Manual to identify the location of every cubby and hold and the contents of each one of them. Next, we went topside and ran through the procedures for raising the mainsail, putting in, shaking out a reef, and then flaking down the sail. With the wind behind us at the dock, sail handling was kind of tricky, but the crew was well up to the challenge. Now, the use of procedures for each step was reinforced, and the crew rapidly saw the value of the step-by-step operation. After a quick lunch aboard, we returned topside, and I led us through the technically complex but fairly straightforward process of rigging and de-rigging the whisker pole. Since none of the students had ever seen the whisker pole in operation before, they were pretty impressed with its dynamics and appreciative of its risks. Dinner that evening was the last opportunity for the crew to spend time apart for the next week, and they took advantage of the time to call home, review procedures, and generally get prepared mentally and physically. Now, Sunday dawned warm, cloudy, and windless. The brisk southerly wind that we'd had the previous day had pretty much disappeared completely, and we were left with only the option of sailing the Iron Jenny. After some time near the marina to give everyone a chance to get a feel for how the boat operated under power, and a stop at the pump-out dock at Langford Bay Marina, we motored out into the gray mist, running down the navigation plan that we had laid out the day before. In the lower part of the Chester River, we ran down a prescribed 2-mile run, then back up to calibrate the knot meter and distance log, per the procedures in a book. Our calculations found that the instrument was not out of calibration, and we noted that in the ship's log. Because I wanted everyone to have an opportunity to act as navigator, helmsman, and student skipper, we didn't set our underway watches yet. We ended the day at a mooring ball in Swan Creek Marina, coming in just as the sun was finally disappearing, and we tied up as the light left the day. Dinner that night was followed by a session of navigation prep by all hands and getting set up to travel the next day from Swan Creek to Summit North Marina on the C&D Canal. By morning, the wind had returned and bringing with it some more clouds and wet weather. We were happy for our foul weather gear as the boat pounded out of Swan Creek into a 20 to 25 knot wind. And once across the Swan Creek shoal, we turned north, we rigged the whisker pole, and with a full main and a poled out Genoa, we sailed up toward the head of the Chesapeake Bay, passing the tall ship Lynx on her way down. The crew had much fun with the fact that we were sailing and the Lynx was running on her motor, but the differences in upwind and downwind performance, particularly on a square-rigged vessel, were an interesting subject of discussion. Now, once we turned up toward the C&D Canal, we doused our sails and we ran along, passing several tugs and barges as they made their way to Baltimore and other points south. Nightfall found us at Summit North Marina, where we were able to take on fuel, pump out, and take a slip for the night. One of the things you learn on a long trip with a large crew is you always pump out when possible. After dinner ashore, the crew completed the navigation plan for the next day for the run down to Cape Charles, and we turned in for the night. Morning found us underway for the Delaware River, once again having departed before the sun came up. The wind had shifted from the south to the north during the evening and was blowing between 5 and 12 knots. While this is enough to sail the boat downwind, a major frontal passage was predicted at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay for the following evening, just after sundown, so it was necessary to make at least 5 knots over ground in order to ensure we were at Cape Charles before that weather degraded to the point that coming into the channel there would become difficult, especially with a tired crew after dark. Because of the need to maintain this certain speed, we were often forced to assist our sails with judicious application of motor power. All through the day and into the night, after we passed offshore and turned down toward the south, we found ourselves having to set and then douse the Iron Jenny. Hours of sailing would be followed by hours of motor sailing, and then once the wind would pick up again, we would secure the engine and sail in blissful silence. One of the most important parts of the 106 cruise is the practical application of the theoretical knowledge taught in the 105 course. We had practiced some of these techniques to get to the C&D Canal. However, the run from Summit North Marina to Cape Charles Marina by way of the Delaware Bay and the Atlantic Ocean overnight was the most important test of the crew's understanding of navigation. For example, it was important that we know the height of the Conrail Bridge as we left Summit North. If it had been lowered for train traffic, we could not have been able to pass. Likewise, we had to take into consideration the jetties at the exit to the canal into the Delaware River. If they'd been underwater due to an unusual tide or weather condition, we had to know exactly how far out we needed to travel before we made our turn downriver. The Delaware River itself is fairly narrow, but it has some good landmarks, so we practiced 3-bearing fixes on the way down, as well as running fixes. Once we moved out between Cape May and Cape Henlopen, we passed a vessel traffic scheme, which directs large vessels in and out of the Delaware Bay. By this time, the sun was going down, and we set our sails for a south-southwest run, starting our nighttime navigation. Night navigation is actually simpler sometimes than daytime navigation, because most aids to navigation are lighted buoys, particularly offshore, making them easier to identify at great distances. As we headed south, we were able to watch the lights on shore, and by correlating the brighter and darker areas with information from our charts, we were able to tell when we were passing areas like Rehoboth Beach or Ocean City. However, once we got past the Maryland-Virginia line, things got dark as the land curved away toward the west. Sunrise found us about 20 miles offshore with Assateague and Chincoteague behind us. We were using a dead reckoning plot to decide when we needed to turn more to the southwest in order to pick up Red Buoy 14, which would direct us in toward Cape Charles and the north entrance to the Chesapeake Bay. By late afternoon, we had found the buoy and cut across the Nautilus Shoal, allowing us to use eyeball navigation under the north span of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. We turned north and followed our track up to the entrance to the Cape Charles Channel, just as the sun slipped below the horizon to start our second night underway. The entrance to the channel is tricky because it makes an almost 90-degree turn partway through. By researching the channel in the Coast Pilot, we knew that there were 2 different ranges that would allow us to keep on course as long as we kept one light over the other. This type of navigation, known as piloting, is hundreds of years old and will allow you to get in safely even if all electronic navigation on board were to fail. We entered the harbor of refuge with me calling the turns and Doug down below monitoring the chart plotter with a student at each location under instruction, of course. We entered the marina itself just with the last glow of daylight fading. We identified a T-head slip that we could use and locked the boat in using techniques from the 118 docking class, which 3 of the 4 students that we had aboard had taken with me earlier this year. The practical ability to see how those techniques could be used for a safe and controlled arrival went far to reinforcing the lessons from that previous class. As a matter of fact, the crew snugged up the boat and we trooped ashore for a well-earned dinner before returning and falling asleep pretty much where people were standing. The next morning, the crew slept in, not rising until almost 6:30. The gear was stowed and the charts came out again as the crew planned their trip back up the bay to Annapolis. Navigation can be divided into 2 parts, preparation and operation. Preparation is all the pre-planning and research you do before getting underway, and it can be very exacting. You choose landmarks, waypoints, routes, and destinations. However, no matter how much preparation you do, operation can often be a totally different experience. This is especially true in a sailboat. You can look at a chart and say, oh, we're going to sail from the entrance to the Cape Charles City Channel to Smith Point Light. But if the wind is coming directly from Smith Point Light, no amount of planning is going to make that a viable sail. You must either motor, if that is possible, or you must adjust your track to the wind. A significant part of sailing is understanding how to get the boat to sail to windward efficiently and effectively. Even beginning sailors understand the idea of tacking to get the boat to move upwind. But it takes a while to learn when to tack to make the best use of wind, current, and the boat. While we knew exactly where we wanted to go, it became the job of the student skipper and navigator to decide how far off of our rum line we could sail before we had to tack and head back. Of course, navigation becomes much more difficult when unusual conditions are added, such as having a member of the crew go overboard. We didn't lose anyone, but we did do many practice crew overboard drills on our trip from Cape Charles to Annapolis, both during the day and after sundown. After each set of drills, the crew had to figure out how far we had drifted and in what direction in order to get us back to our intended course. In addition to the crew overboard drills, the Chesapeake Bay is a major thoroughfare for shipping of all kinds, as well as recreational vessels of all sizes and types. Because of these other vessels, we often found that we had to deviate from our intended course in order to avoid collisions. Each time we did so, we would refigure our track to ensure that we would arrive at our next waypoint or change the waypoint altogether if the traffic was too frequent. By 11 o'clock, the navigation plan was formed and approved and the weather was reviewed. Initially, the wind was predicted to be from the north at about 20 knots before dropping through the day and backing into the southwest. Because of the possibility of strong winds on the nose, we decided to put in the second reef in the mainsail before we left port. It's always easier to shake a reef out if you don't need it than it is to try and put one in if you do. We want so don't make it tight, make it nice and loose. After setting the main, putting in the reef and dropping the main again, we traveled over the fuel dock to take on more fuel and to pump out one more time. Now, Doug took the control position for this trip and I manned the wheel. With the wind blowing off the dock at about 15 knots, gusting occasionally to 20, I once again used the techniques that we taught in the 118 class to reinforce the ability to handle a large boat in a narrow area under challenging wind conditions. The crew that had taken the course before remarked that it was like getting the master's class in docking, and even the Cape Charles dockhand was impressed to see what was to him a new technique. After adding to one tank and draining out the other, Doug took control again and ran us out into the Chesapeake Bay. The wind was rolling the boat pretty heavily as we came out of the channel, but after clearing the entrance buoy and setting the sails, she settled in and handled really well. Unfortunately, by now the wind was right on the bow, and it became necessary for us to tack our way up the rum line. First off on one side by about a nautical mile, and then tack and come back the other way. We were having a great sail, but it was really cutting into our velocity made good. So once clear of the channel and free to maneuver, I ran the crew through crew overboard drills. We emphasized and reinforced the Maryland School primary concept of stopping the boat as quickly as possible, keeping the crew overboard in sight, and getting the boat upwind in order to work down to effect a recovery. The crew quickly understood how this practice made recovery safer and more effective in a big boat on a big ocean. By the time the drills were finished, the wind had dropped to the point where we could shake out the reef and set the Genoa and sail upwind, but the angle still required tacking around the rum line. The crew got practice in tacking a big headsail around an inner stay, which is a significantly different technique than simply allowing the Genoa to blow across an open fore triangle, which you normally do with a sloop. As the wind continued to drop, it eventually became necessary to assist the apparent wind with some judicious use of the engine, allowing for the tight sail close hauled actually on the rum line. As the evening progressed and the sun dipped below the horizon, I once again had some crew overboard drills, this time in the dark. Reinforcing the idea of stopping the boat, we now had to maneuver toward a flashing strobe inside our crew overboard mannequin, which is a much trickier task. The crew quickly developed skills at getting next to the crew overboard and getting the rescue line on to pull them back into the boat. Now, maintaining our track to Annapolis was easy from this point on, as the wind was coming over the port bow. The predicted shift to the south did not come, so the wind from the north stayed cold. Temperatures on the boat approached freezing, and the crew stayed bundled up while on watch, with much tea and coffee consumed. Near midnight, I ran an unannounced crew overboard drill, simulating that the helmsman had fallen overboard while the rover was below and the off-watch was asleep. Even these trying conditions did not faze the by now well-trained crew, and the crew overboard dummy was back on board and receiving his simulated medicinal brandy within 10 minutes. An excellent time given that the water temperature was still well into the high 60s. The voyage continued through the night with the on-watch team, monitored by the duty instructor, performing night collision avoidance tasks with huge freighters, tugs both pushing and pulling barges, and all sorts of fishing and sailing recreational craft. Nighttime navigation skills were also in practice, allowing for 2 and 3 bearing fixes off of lights. Dawn found us sailing along, but the wind finally worked around to our port quarter and came up enough that it would bring warmer temperatures and a blessed relief from sailing with the engine. We were able to sail up past the Thomas Point Shoal Light, where the student skipper of the day sadly doused the sails, and turned us up to our anchorage in the mooring fields off the Naval Academy. Afternoon included a review for the 106 exams, showers and shopping ashore for some, and trips ashore for dinner for all at the Annapolis waterfront restaurant, where we also had an obligatory stop at Pusser's to taste the grog. It was well earned for a crew that had just about completed their circumnavigation. Now, Saturday morning found the crew dropping the mooring ball well before sunup again, and we cleared the channel into the naval anchorage at the mouth of the Severn. So the mainsail came out, the Genoa came out, the engine went off, and the crew performed a paper chart-based dead reckoning under the bridge and across the bay, turning around Love Point and crossing their track to actually complete the circumnavigation. I had secured the chart plotter and the radar and required the crew to navigate using nothing but the depth finder, the knot meter, and the compass. Over the night, the wind had come up, but the clouds had come back again, and although it was warm, the sky was blanketed again. Just as the crew came up the Chester River, the sky cleared for just about a half an hour, and it allowed us to do a sun-based compass deviation exercise to verify that our compass was actually accurate. The crew noted that while watching Captain Tercey's video on the subject was informative, actually seeing the procedure done was invaluable in understanding the process. The crew finally returned to Langford Bay Marina at about 1400 or 2 o'clock. If we left 150 hours prior and we traveled more than 400 miles, and during that period we'd spent less than 36 hours in port, and we'd traveled in all sorts of weather: warm, cold, cloudy, sunny, windy, and no wind. The trip was an exercise in working with an unaccustomed group of people in challenging conditions while living together in a small boat. It's not an exercise that most people would accept, much less relish, but for Sarah, Peter, Jose, and Glenn, it's an adventure they'll long remember, and for Doug and I, it's an experience that we find rewarding and satisfying. Until next time, this is Captain Frank Mummert of the Maryland School of Sailing, saying fair winds and following seas.